What happens when a power-tripping cop targets the wrong black woman in a quiet park? Only to realize too late she has a direct line to the FBI director. Officer Daniel Brooks thought he was about to control just another ordinary citizen, but he had no idea he was stepping straight into his own downfall. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun stretched long, golden beams across Riverside Park, casting soft light over the winding paths and still water of the lake. It was the kind of peaceful scene that made the city feel distant, like the noise and tension of everyday life had been carefully folded away, somewhere out of reach. A gentle breeze moved through the tall oak trees, stirring leaves just enough to create a quiet rustling sound that blended with the distant laughter of children near the playground. On a weathered wooden bench facing the water, Vanessa Carter sat with composed stillness, a slim folder resting neatly on her lap. Her posture was upright but relaxed, shoulders steady, breathing slow and controlled in a way that suggested discipline rather than leisure. To anyone passing by, she looked like nothing more than a woman taking a break from her day, perhaps reviewing paperwork or simply enjoying a quiet moment. Her clothing reflected that same understated simplicity, a light gray blouse paired with dark slacks, practical and unremarkable, the kind of outfit that never drew a second glance. But there was something else, something harder to define, in the way her eyes moved. They were not wandering aimlessly like most people resting in the park. Instead, they observed. Every movement, every shift in the environment registered quietly behind her calm expression. A jogger passed by, shoes striking the pavement in a steady rhythm, and Vanessa acknowledged him with a slight nod before returning her attention to the pages in front of her. A mother called out to her child near the swings, her voice carrying lightly across the open space. Vanessa turned a single page in her folder with precise care, the paper making a soft, deliberate sound. Nothing about her movements was rushed. Nothing was careless. It was the kind of quiet control that came from years of experience, though no one nearby would have guessed what kind. A couple walking their dog slowed briefly as they passed her, their eyes lingering for just a moment longer than necessary before moving on. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it happened often enough to be familiar. Vanessa did not react. She never did. Instead, she closed the folder halfway, resting her hand over it as she looked out across the lake. The sunlight shimmered across the surface, broken occasionally by the gentle ripple of ducks gliding through the water. For a brief moment, everything felt still, peaceful, ordinary. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something waited. Not in the park itself, but in the unseen tension that always followed her, in the quiet awareness that moments like this rarely stayed undisturbed for long. Vanessa Carter sat there, composed and unbothered, appearing to the world as just another face in the crowd. But the truth was far more complex, and before this day was over, that truth would force its way into the open in a way no one present would ever forget. The stillness did not break all at once. It shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow stretching longer across the ground. From the far edge of the park's main path, the low hum of an idling engine crept into the background, subtle at first, then persistent enough to pull attention. A black and white patrol car rolled slowly along the curb, its movement deliberate, almost predatory in its pacing. Officer Daniel Brooks sat behind the wheel, one arm resting casually near the open window, his gaze sweeping across the park with a practiced sense of ownership. He had worked this district for over 15 years, and in his mind, there was very little he had not already seen, judged, and categorized. Families gathered near the playground barely registered. Joggers passed without interest. But then his eyes landed on Vanessa Carter. Something about her stillness caught him. Not the relaxed kind of stillness, but something firmer, more controlled. His jaw tightened slightly as he leaned forward, narrowing his focus. A woman sitting alone, composed, not distracted by her phone, not fidgeting, not restless. To Brooks, that kind of calm did not read as normal. It read as calculated. The cruiser slowed even more, tires crunching lightly against gravel as he adjusted his angle for a better look. Vanessa did not turn. She did not acknowledge him. That, more than anything, stirred irritation beneath his uniform. Most people glanced at a patrol car, even briefly. It was instinct, but she remained exactly as she was, gaze steady over the lake, hand resting on the folder in her lap, as if the world behind her did not exist. Brooks exhaled through his nose, a faint tension building along his jawline. "That's not right," he muttered under his breath, the words carrying a tone of quiet certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with assumption. He shifted the cruiser into park without taking his eyes off her. The engine remained running, a low vibration beneath the hood. For a moment, he simply watched, cataloging, interpreting, convincing himself that his instincts were never wrong. A couple walking past noticed the cruiser and instinctively adjusted their path, giving it space. Brooks barely registered them. His attention had locked onto a single point. Vanessa Carter. The door opened with a firm push, the sound cutting through the soft ambient noise of the park. His boots hit the pavement with a measured heaviness, each step intentional, each movement carrying the quiet authority he believed came with a badge on his chest. He adjusted his belt slightly, fingers brushing against the equipment secured there, a habitual gesture more about posture than necessity. As he began walking toward her, his shoulders squared, his stride lengthened just enough to signal purpose. People nearby noticed now. A subtle shift in the environment followed him. Conversations lowering, eyes tracking his approach without making it obvious. Vanessa, however, remained unchanged. She turned one more page in her folder, the motion smooth, unhurried, as if the approaching presence had already been accounted for long before it arrived. Brooks stopped a few feet in front of her, casting a shadow that stretched across the ground and brushed the edge of her shoes. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence hang, expecting her to look up first, to acknowledge him, to yield that small but important gesture of deference. She did not. That silence pressed against him in a way he did not like. His lips tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a sharp edge that cut through the calm of the park. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" he asked, tone firm, not a question as much as a demand wrapped in one. Only then did Vanessa lift her gaze, slow and deliberate, meeting his eyes without hesitation, without fear, and most importantly, without apology. Vanessa held his gaze without flinching, her expression composed, almost neutral, as if his question carried no weight beyond simple curiosity. "I'm sitting," she replied, her voice even, unhurried, the kind of tone that neither challenged nor submitted. It was a straightforward answer, but something in its simplicity seemed to irritate Brooks more than defiance would have. His jaw tightened, the muscle along his cheek flexing as he shifted his stance slightly closer, boots pressing into the gravel with a faint crunch. "Don't play games with me," he said, his voice lowering, losing any trace of casual civility. "I asked what you're doing out here." Vanessa tilted her head, just slightly, as if considering how much energy the conversation deserved. "Enjoying the park," she answered, folding the edge of her folder closed with a precise motion and resting both hands calmly on top of it. Her posture remained relaxed, shoulders steady, eyes fixed on his without aggression, without apology. Brooks exhaled sharply through his nose, the sound carrying impatience. He took another step closer, closing the distance in a way that shifted the interaction from inquiry to control. "You got ID on you?" he asked, though the phrasing suggested it was not a request. Around them, the park's quiet rhythm had begun to fracture. Conversations softened. A man walking his dog slowed his pace just enough to glance over before pretending not to notice. Vanessa did not look away. "I'm not required to show identification without reasonable suspicion," she said calmly, her words measured, precise, spoken like someone who understood exactly where the line was and had no intention of stepping over it. That response landed harder than a raised voice ever could. Brooks' lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing as something sharper crept into his expression, something less about procedure and more about being challenged. Reasonable suspicion, he echoed, a faint, humorless scoff slipping into his tone. You think you get to decide that? He shifted his weight forward, his presence looming now, his hand brushing briefly against his belt in a gesture that was not accidental. I've had reports of suspicious individuals in this area, he continued, his voice gaining volume just enough to carry to anyone nearby who might be listening. And right now, you're fitting that description. Vanessa's gaze did not waver. What description would that be? She asked quietly. The question hung between them, deliberate, controlled, forcing him to define what he clearly could not articulate. Brooks' nostrils flared slightly, the corners of his mouth tightening as the lack of an easy answer irritated him further. Don't get smart, he snapped, his tone sharpening. You're being uncooperative. Vanessa allowed a small pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but precision. I'm being respectful, she said, her voice still steady, and I'm exercising my rights. The distinction seemed to land like a challenge he could not tolerate. Brooks stepped even closer, close enough now that his shadow fully covered her, his posture rigid, his presence pressing down like a weight meant to force compliance. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice dropping into a controlled, authoritative cadence. You're going to stand up, keep your hands where I can see them, and you're going to give me your identification. Or I'm going to assume you've got something to hide, and we're going to handle this a different way. The threat was no longer subtle. It sat plainly between them, heavy and unmistakable. Around them, the air felt tighter, the quiet no longer peaceful but tense, stretched thin by the imbalance of power on display. Vanessa did not move immediately. Instead, she held his gaze for one more measured second, as if weighing not his words, but his character, his certainty, the path he was choosing to take. Then, slowly, deliberately, she placed her folder beside her on the bench, her movements controlled, her breathing steady, every motion signaling that whatever came next, she was not the one losing control. Vanessa rose from the bench with deliberate slowness, her movements controlled, her hands visible exactly as instructed, but there was no urgency in her compliance, no trace of fear in the way she carried herself. It was not submission. It was precision. Brooks watched her closely, his eyes scanning every motion as if expecting a sudden move, something he could justify reacting to. When none came, his irritation deepened. Turn around, he ordered sharply, gesturing with 2 fingers as he stepped closer, invading her space without hesitation. Vanessa turned, steady and silent, her gaze now forward, posture straight, shoulders squared in a way that spoke of discipline rather than obedience. The contrast only fueled Brooks further. Hands behind your back, he added, his voice tightening. There was a brief pause, just a fraction of a second, before Vanessa complied, bringing her hands together behind her with controlled ease. That pause did not go unnoticed. Brooks' expression hardened, his jaw setting as he reached for his cuffs, the metal catching the sunlight as he pulled them free. Around them, the park had grown noticeably quieter. The jogger who had passed earlier slowed to a stop at a distance, pretending to stretch while watching. A couple near the path stood still, their conversation forgotten. Phones were not raised yet, but attention had shifted fully. Brooks stepped in behind Vanessa, close enough that his presence felt like pressure against her back. You should have just cooperated, he muttered, not loud enough for the crowd, but clear enough for her. Would have made this a lot easier on yourself. Vanessa did not respond. Her breathing remained even, her gaze fixed ahead, her silence not empty, but intentional. That silence seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. In one firm motion, Brooks grabbed her wrist, pulling her hands slightly higher than necessary before snapping the cuff closed around one side. The movement was controlled, but there was an edge to it, a deliberate display of authority. He secured the second cuff just as tightly, the click final definitive. Vanessa's posture shifted only slightly to adjust, but there was no struggle, no resistance, no reaction beyond what was physically required. That lack of reaction unsettled him in a way he could not quite explain. He stepped back just enough to look at her, his chest rising a bit faster now, his control beginning to blur into something more personal. "You're being detained for suspicious activity and failure to identify," he announced, louder this time, projecting his voice outward, as if needing the crowd to hear his justification. The words echoed across the nearby path, drawing even more attention. Vanessa turned her head just slightly, enough to acknowledge him without fully facing him. "On what legal basis?" she asked, her tone calm, almost clinical, as if she were documenting the moment rather than living in it. The question landed like a needle. Brooks' expression flickered, irritation flashing across his face before hardening again. "Don't worry about that," he snapped, stepping forward and placing a firm hand against her upper arm, guiding her toward the patrol car with more force than necessary. "You can explain everything down at the station." Vanessa allowed herself to be moved, her steps steady, her balance never breaking, even as his grip tightened slightly in an attempt to control her pace. Gravel shifted under their feet as they moved, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet space. The cruiser loomed ahead, engines still running, the low vibration humming beneath the tension that had now fully taken hold of the scene. Behind them, the onlookers had stopped pretending not to watch. The moment had crossed a line. But Vanessa Carter walked forward without resistance, her calm unshaken, her silence heavier now, as if it carried something Brooks had not yet realized he had already triggered. The patrol car door stood open, its dark interior waiting like a final step in a process Brooks had already decided was justified. He guided Vanessa forward with a firm grip on her arm, his fingers pressing just enough to assert control without crossing into something he could not explain away. "Watch your step," he said, though the words carried no real concern, only impatience. Vanessa moved exactly as needed, her balance steady despite the restraint on her wrists, her gaze forward, unbroken. As they reached the cruiser, Brooks shifted his position, one hand moving to the top of her shoulder, applying downward pressure to direct her toward the back seat. It was a practice motion, one he had done countless times, but this time there was something sharper in it, something fueled by the quiet resistance he could not quite name. "Head down," he instructed, his tone clipped. Vanessa complied, just enough to avoid contact with the doorframe, then paused at the edge of the seat instead of immediately sitting. That pause, small as it was, caused Brooks' patience to snap tighter. "I said get in," he barked, his voice rising now, drawing even more attention from the onlookers scattered across the park. A woman near the path lifted her phone, hesitating before beginning to record. Vanessa lowered herself into the seat with controlled precision, her movements deliberate, refusing to be rushed even under pressure. Once inside, she adjusted slightly to sit upright, her cuffed hands resting against her lower back, shoulders still straight despite the awkward position. Brooks leaned in, briefly checking the positioning of the cuffs, tugging once as if testing them, the motion unnecessary but intentional. "Comfortable?" he muttered, a trace of sarcasm slipping through. Vanessa turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged. "Are you?" she asked quietly. The question caught him off guard, not because of what it meant, but because of how calmly it was delivered. His eyes narrowed, irritation flashing again as he stepped back and shut the door with a solid, echoing thud. The sound seemed to ripple outward, marking a point of no return in the interaction. Brooks walked around to the driver's side, his movements quicker now, less measured than before. He opened the door, slid into the seat, and pulled it shut with force, the interior of the cruiser closing in around him. For a moment, he just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, jaw tight, breathing slightly heavier than it should have been for such a routine situation. In the rearview mirror, Vanessa's reflection remained steady. She did not look around. She did not fidget. She did not speak. That stillness pressed against him again, the same way it had on the bench, the same way it had throughout the encounter. It felt wrong to him, unnatural, like something was out of place, and he could not identify what. He reached for the radio, pressing the button with more force than necessary. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14, he said, his voice controlled but edged. "I've got one detained for suspicious activity. Transporting now." A brief crackle answered back. Routine acknowledgement, nothing unusual. Brooks released the button, glancing once more into the mirror. Vanessa met his eyes through the reflection this time, her gaze steady, unblinking, as if she had been waiting for that moment. There was no fear there, no anger, just a quiet certainty that seemed completely out of sync with the situation he believed he controlled. Brooks looked away first, his grip tightening slightly on the wheel as he shifted the cruiser into drive. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the vehicle began to move, pulling away from the curb, leaving behind the quiet park that had now transformed into a stage for something far bigger than a simple arrest. And still, in the back seat, Vanessa Carter remained composed, her silence no longer passive, but deliberate, as if she knew that what was coming next would not be decided by the man in the driver's seat. The patrol car rolled steadily along the quiet streets bordering Riverside Park, the hum of the engine filling the space between them like a low, constant reminder of control. Officer Daniel Brooks kept his eyes forward, one hand firm on the wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the radio as if maintaining routine, though his jaw remained tight, his posture rigid. In the back seat, Vanessa Carter sat exactly as she had before, upright despite the restraints, her presence unchanged, as if the movement of the vehicle had no effect on her at all. Brooks exhaled slowly, then reached toward the mounted computer beside him, tapping a few keys with deliberate force. "We'll get you processed downtown," he said, his voice carrying that same clipped authority. "Run your name. See what comes up. If you got priors, this just got a lot worse for you." He glanced briefly into the rearview mirror, watching for a reaction. There was none. Vanessa's eyes met his reflection, steady and unreadable. That silence again. It pressed against him, heavier now inside the confined space of the cruiser. He shifted slightly in his seat, irritation flickering across his face. "You know," he continued, his tone turning almost conversational, though the edge never left it. "People make this harder on themselves all the time. You could have just shown ID. Walked away. Instead, now you're in the back of my car." Vanessa let a few seconds pass before responding, her voice calm, measured, cutting through the hum of the engine with quiet precision. "You still have time to stop this." The words landed differently than anything she had said before. Not defensive, not reactive. A statement. Brooks' lips curled slightly, a faint, dismissive smile forming as he shook his head. "Stop what?" he asked, a dry note in his voice. "Doing my job?" Vanessa's gaze did not shift. "You are making a mistake that will not stay contained," she said, each word deliberate, her tone neither raised nor emotional, but carrying a weight that suggested certainty rather than warning. Brooks let out a short breath through his nose, something close to amusement, but sharpened by annoyance. "That's so," he replied, his fingers tightening briefly around the steering wheel. "And what exactly do you think is going to happen?" Vanessa leaned back slightly against the seat, as much as the cuffs allowed, her posture still composed. "You're not just detaining a random civilian," she said. "And once this moves beyond your control, there won't be a way to walk it back." There was a pause, not silence, but a shift. Brooks' eyes flicked to the mirror again, holding her gaze for a second longer this time. Something in her tone did not match the situation he believed he was in control of, but instead of hesitation, it sparked defiance. His expression hardened, the faint smile returning, colder now. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dipping with sarcasm. "You've got friends in high places." "That it?" He let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head. "Everybody says that." Vanessa did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was even quieter but sharper. "I'm giving you one opportunity to correct this before it escalates." Brooks laughed under his breath, the sound brief but dismissive, his shoulders settling as if the decision had already been made. "No," he said flatly. "What you're doing is trying to intimidate an officer. That's not going to work." He reached for the radio again, pressing the button with firm intent. "Dispatch," he said, his tone steady, controlled. "Go ahead and notify intake. I'm bringing one in, non-compliant, possible obstruction." He He released the button and leaned back slightly, the faint smirk still on his face as he glanced once more into the mirror. "You had your chance," he added, his voice final, sealing the moment. In the back seat, Vanessa Carter remained still, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes shifted, not in fear, not in anger, but in quiet resolution, as if the path forward had just been locked into place, and whatever came next would no longer depend on him at all. The cruiser had barely cleared the edge of the park when Vanessa shifted slightly in the back seat, her restrained hands adjusting just enough to reach into the inner lining of her sleeve with careful precision. The movement was subtle, controlled, and for a brief second, Brooks did not notice. His focus remained ahead, his expression set, his mind already moving toward paperwork, toward justification, toward closing the situation in his favor. "Before we get to the station," Vanessa said calmly, her voice cutting through the quiet interior with a new weight, "I am making one call." Brooks let out a faint breath, somewhere between annoyance and dismissal. "You can make your calls after processing," he replied without turning. "That's how this works." Vanessa did not argue. Instead, she tilted her wrist just enough, revealing a slim device she had managed to free, her fingers moving with deliberate accuracy despite the constraints. The faint tone of a call initiating filled the car, soft but unmistakable. Brooks' head snapped slightly toward the rearview mirror, his brow tightening. "What are you doing?" he demanded, the first crack in his control slipping into his voice. Vanessa did not answer him. Instead, she held the device steady near her shoulder, her posture unchanged, her eyes focused forward as the line connected. Then, her voice shifted. It was no longer just calm. It was authoritative, precise, carrying a tone that did not belong to someone pleading for help. "Director Whitaker," she said, each word clear, controlled, "this is Vanessa Carter. Badge clearance level 7-3. I am currently detained without cause by a local officer. Location is Riverside Perimeter, heading northbound." The effect was immediate. Brooks' hands tightened on the wheel, his breath catching just slightly as the words registered. He glanced again into the mirror, this time not with irritation, but with something sharper, something uncertain. "You need to end that call," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, the edge no longer as solid as before. Vanessa continued as if he had not spoken. "Yes, sir. I will remain compliant," she added, her tone unwavering. "But I suggest immediate intervention." There was a pause, brief but heavy. Then she lowered the device slightly, listening before responding with a single, calm, "Understood." She ended the call. Silence filled the cruiser again, but it was no longer the same silence. It pressed in from all sides, thick with something Brooks could not ignore. His grip on the steering wheel shifted, fingers tightening, then loosening, his eyes flicking between the road and the mirror with increasing frequency. "Who did you just call?" he asked, his voice no longer sharp but strained, searching for control he could feel slipping. Vanessa met his gaze through the reflection, her expression composed, but now there was something unmistakable behind it, something final. "The FBI director," she said simply. The words landed with weight that could not be dismissed. Brooks blinked, once, then again, as if trying to process what he had just heard. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, his jaw working as the certainty that had carried him this far began to fracture. The road ahead suddenly felt longer, the space inside the cruiser smaller. "That's not," he started, but the words faltered, unfinished. His eyes darted back to the mirror, searching her face for any sign of bluff, of exaggeration, of anything that would restore the version of reality he had been operating in just moments ago. There was nothing there but calm certainty. And for the first time since he had stepped out of his cruiser in that quiet park, Officer Daniel Brooks felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not anger, not control, but the cold, creeping realization that he had just crossed a line he could not step back from. The silence inside the cruiser did not last long. It fractured suddenly, violently, with a sharp burst of static from the radio mounted on Brooks' dashboard. "Unit 14, pull over immediately," a voice commanded, no hesitation, no room for interpretation. It was not the usual dispatch tone. It was higher authority, direct and unmistakable. Brooks froze for half a second, his foot hovering uncertainly over the accelerator. "Repeat, Unit 14, pull over now. Do not proceed to the station." The words landed like a hammer. Brooks' throat tightened as his eyes flicked rapidly between the road and the rearview mirror. Vanessa Carter sat exactly as before, composed, unmoving, her gaze steady, as if she had been expecting this moment down to the second. A flicker of panic crossed Brooks' face, subtle but undeniable. His hands adjusted on the steering wheel, grip uneven now. Without another word, he eased the cruiser toward the side of the road, tires rolling onto the gravel shoulder with a rough crunch that echoed louder than it should have. The engine idled, but nothing about the moment felt routine anymore. Before Brooks could speak, before he could attempt to regain any sense of control, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. Not one, multiple. Approaching fast. His head snapped toward the side mirror. Black SUVs appeared in the distance, moving with precision, their speed controlled but urgent, their presence unmistakable. Federal. Brooks' breathing changed, shallow now, uneven. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice no longer commanding, but strained, edged with something closer to fear. Vanessa did not answer. She did not need to. Within seconds, the SUVs surrounded the cruiser, positioning with practiced coordination, cutting off any path forward or back. Doors opened in near unison. Agents stepped out, their movements sharp, efficient, their eyes locked onto the situation with immediate clarity. One of them approached the driver's side, his expression unreadable, his presence alone enough to shift the entire balance of power. Brooks' hand hovered uncertainly near the door handle, then pulled back, unsure now of what action would make things worse. A firm knock landed against his window. "Open the door," the agent said, his voice low, controlled, carrying authority that did not need to be raised. Brooks swallowed hard, his fingers fumbling slightly before unlocking the door. He stepped out slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him from all sides. The park, the road, the quiet afternoon he had once controlled, now felt distant, replaced by something far more rigid, far more absolute. "Officer Daniel Brooks?" the agent asked. Brooks nodded, barely. "You are being relieved of duty pending investigation." The agent continued, his words precise, final. "Step away from the vehicle." Brooks' shoulders dropped, the tension draining out of him in a way that left him exposed, smaller somehow. His hand instinctively moved toward his badge, then stopped midway, as if unsure whether he still had the right to touch it. Another agent moved to the rear door, opening it carefully. Vanessa Carter stepped out with assistance, her posture unchanged, her composure intact. The cuffs were removed immediately, the metal slipping away from her wrists as if they had never belonged there in the first place. She adjusted her sleeves slightly, her movements calm, controlled, as she stepped forward. Brooks watched, frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile the image before him. The woman he had forced into his cruiser now stood surrounded by federal agents who treated her with unmistakable respect. One of them nodded slightly toward her. "Mom." That single word carried more weight than anything Brooks had said all day. Vanessa glanced briefly at Brooks, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a quiet finality that left no room for misunderstanding. The moment had passed beyond him, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. The tension that had gripped the roadside slowly began to dissolve, replaced by a controlled, deliberate calm that followed the arrival of authority that did not need to prove itself. Officer Daniel Brooks stood a few steps away from his cruiser, his posture no longer rigid, no longer commanding. His shoulders had sunk, his stance uncertain, as if the ground beneath him had shifted into something unfamiliar. One of the federal agents stood beside him now, not aggressive, not forceful, but firm in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Brooks' badge was removed with careful precision, unclipped from his uniform and held briefly in the agent's hand before being placed into an evidence pouch. That small action carried more weight than any words. Brooks watched it happen, his eyes fixed, his expression hollowing as the reality settled in fully. There was no argument left, no authority to lean on, no voice raised in protest. Just silence, and the unmistakable understanding that everything he had relied on was gone. A second agent guided him gently, but firmly toward the back of another vehicle, not with violence, but with quiet finality. Brooks complied without resistance, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more fragile. Nearby, the world continued to move. A car passed slowly on the opposite side of the road, its driver glancing over with curiosity before continuing on. The park beyond the trees remained still, untouched, as if it had already begun to forget the disruption that had taken place. Vanessa Carter stood near the open door of one of the black SUVs, her hands now free, her posture unchanged from the moment she had first sat on that bench. One of the agents handed her a small identification wallet, the leather worn but immaculate. She opened it briefly, checking its contents with a practiced glance before closing it again and slipping it back into place. "Everything is being handled," the agent said quietly, his tone respectful, measured. Vanessa gave a slight nod, her expression calm, her eyes briefly scanning the scene one last time. They paused for a moment on Brooks, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet acknowledgement of consequence. Then she turned away. The SUV door was held open for her, and she stepped inside with the same composed precision she had carried from the very beginning. "No rus, no hositaschen." The door closed softly behind her, sealing the moment. The convoy began to move shortly after, engines starting in unison, vehicles pulling away with smooth coordination. Within moments, they were gone, leaving behind nothing but the fading sound of tires on pavement and the quiet stretch of road returning to its ordinary rhythm. The air felt lighter now, as if something heavy had been lifted. Back in Riverside Park, the same golden light stretched across the lake, unchanged, uninterrupted. The bench where Vanessa had been sitting remained empty, the faint imprint of her presence already fading into the stillness of the afternoon. A child's laughter carried again from the playground, bright and unburdened. Leaves rustled gently in the breeze. The world, steady and enduring, moved forward. And somewhere beyond the view of that quiet park, Vanessa Carter continued on, unseen, unshaken, her work carried in silence. Her presence felt only in the balance she restored, leaving behind a reminder that power, when misused, does not stand for long, and that justice, though quiet, always finds its way.